June 24th, 1948, Tempelhof Airport, West Berlin. The roar of aircraft engines had become silence. Friedrich Hartmann stood at the edge of the runway, his left arm still aching where the shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone 3 years earlier. The phantom pain always returned when the weather changed, but today it pulsed for a different reason. Today the sky was empty. The Soviet military trucks had blocked the last road from West Germany at dawn, and now Berlin, this island of 2.2 million souls, surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory, was cut off from the world. Friedrich pressed his remaining good hand against the chain-link fence and watched the eastern horizon, where Soviet fighters patrolled in lazy circles. He had survived the war. He had survived the bombing that took his arm. But this silence might kill them all. He did not know, could not have known, that within 72 hours the same engines that had delivered destruction would return with salvation. 3 years earlier, Friedrich had learned what American aircraft sounded like. The lesson had cost him dearly. February 15th, 1945. The B-17 bombers came at noon, wave after wave, their formations so tight they seemed to blot out the winter sun. Friedrich, then a 19-year-old Wehrmacht conscript stationed at an anti-aircraft battery in Berlin's eastern sector, had watched them approach with the detached fascination of someone who had already accepted death. The propaganda ministry had promised that the Reich's new weapons would drive the Americans from the sky. But the only thing falling that day was Berlin itself. The blast that took his arm also took 3 of his battery mates. He remembered the moment with cruel clarity. The whistle of the bomb, the pressure wave that felt like God's own fist. Then nothing but white silence. When he woke, he was buried under rubble. His left arm pinned beneath a concrete beam, blood pooling in the dust. The arm was still attached, technically, but he could see bone and the gray-blue gleam of a severed artery. He should have died there. The German military hospital was overwhelmed, operating in a basement with dwindling supplies. Wounded soldiers lined the corridors, waiting their turn for treatment that might never come. Friedrich waited for 6 hours, feeling his life leak away with each heartbeat, before a harried surgeon finally looked at him. "Amputation," the doctor said, not unkindly. "If we had seen you 3 hours ago, we might have saved it. But now." They gave him no anesthesia. There was none left, only a leather strap to bite and 4 orderlies to hold him down. Friedrich learned that day that a human being could experience pain so profound it became almost abstract, a condition of existence rather than a sensation. When they were finished, when they had sawed through bone and tied off blood vessels with thread salvaged from parachute cord, he was no longer the same person. The boy who had believed in Germany's invincibility had been amputated along with the arm. After the war ended, Friedrich returned to his family's apartment in Yedding, or rather, to the pile of bricks that had been his family's apartment. His mother and sister had died in a raid 2 months before his injury. His father, a postal worker, had vanished on the Eastern Front in 1943. Friedrich was 20 years old, alone, and carried in his body the permanent proof of American military power. He found work as a clerk in the British sector, his handwriting awkward but legible with his right hand. He learned to tie his shoes one-handed to button his shirt, to navigate the ruins of Berlin with the particular wariness of someone who had lost everything that could be lost. When he passed American soldiers on the street, and there were thousands of them now, occupying the western sectors, he felt the old hatred flicker in his chest. These men, or men like them, had destroyed his city, killed his family, taken his arm. The American money they spent in German shops felt like blood money. Their easy laughter, their chewing gum and chocolate bars and casual confidence, it all seemed obscene in a city where children scavenged for coal in the rubble. But he had learned to keep such feelings hidden. The Americans were in charge now. Hatred was a luxury he could not afford. The blockade changed everything overnight. When Stalin's forces cut off all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin on that June morning, The city's western sectors held exactly 36 days' worth of food and 45 days' worth of coal. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor, had already calculated the mathematics of starvation: 2.2 million people, each requiring a minimum of 1,950 calories per day to survive. That meant 3,600 tons of food had to enter the city daily, plus coal, medicine, and everything else a modern city needed to function. The Soviets believed it was impossible. Every serious military logistics expert agreed. You could not supply a city of 2 million people by air. The physics alone defied reason. The largest successful airlift in history had delivered a few hundred tons per day for a few weeks. What Clay was proposing required moving 15 times that amount, indefinitely, in the most congested airspace in Europe. Friedrich, like 86% of Berliners surveyed that July, believed the Americans would abandon them by winter. Why wouldn't they? Berlin was Stalin's prize, the capital of the Reich he had helped destroy. The Western powers had no legal obligation to risk their pilots' lives for German civilians. The smart move, the obvious move, was to hand over the Western sectors and avoid a shooting war with the Soviet Union. On June 26th, 2 days after the blockade began, Friedrich heard the sound that would define the next 15 months of his life. It started as a distant drone, growing louder until it vibrated in his chest. He looked up from his desk. He had been cataloging supply requisitions, a grimly ironic task given the circumstances, and saw through the window a C-47 transport aircraft descending toward Tempelhof. Then another, then another. They came in a steady stream, landing every 4 minutes, their engines never quite falling silent before the next plane appeared. Friedrich walked outside, joining the small crowd gathering at the airport's perimeter fence. The Americans were unloading the aircraft with frantic efficiency. Forklifts, conveyor belts, a human chain of soldiers passing sacks of flour hand to hand. He watched one young pilot, he could not have been more than 23, younger than Friedrich, climb out of his cockpit, his face gray with exhaustion, and immediately begin refueling for the return flight. Crazy, muttered the man next to Friedrich, an older Berliner with a face like leather. They'll keep this up for a week, maybe 2. Then reality will set in, but reality had other plans. The Americans called it Operation Vittles. The British called it Operation Plain Fare. The Berliners, with characteristic dark humor, called it Die Luftbrücke, the air bridge, as if you could build a bridge from nothing but noise and faith. By July, the operation had found its rhythm. Aircraft landed at Tempelhof, Gatow, and the hastily constructed Tegel airfield every 3 minutes during peak hours. The pilots flew in weather that would have grounded civilian aircraft, navigating by instruments through fog so thick you could not see the runway until you were 50 feet above it. They flew at night, guided by radio beacons and the prayers of ground crews. They flew through Soviet harassment, searchlights in their eyes, fighters buzzing their wings. Radio jamming that could disorient even experienced pilots, and they flew loaded. Each C-54 Skymaster could carry 10 tons. Each C-47 could carry 4. The British used Sunderland flying boats, landing on the Havel River with holds full of salt and dehydrated potatoes. Every flight was calculated down to the pound. Too little cargo and you wasted fuel. Too much and you risked a crash. The Americans developed a system of such precision that it bordered on madness. Planes loaded in exactly 18 minutes, unloaded in 12, turned around in 49. Any delay cascaded through the whole operation. Friedrich watched this machinery of logistics unfold with unwilling awe. He had been a soldier, he understood military operations, but this was something different. This was an army fighting gravity and time instead of people, and winning. In August, his ration card entitled him to 1,580 calories per day, below subsistence level, but enough to survive. The food came from the aircraft: dehydrated potatoes, powdered milk, flour, canned meat. It tasted like dust and charity, and he hated every bite. But he ate. His landlady, Frau Müller, was less conflicted. She had lost her husband to the Eastern Front and both sons to the Battle of Berlin. When she received her first package of American flour, she wept. Mein Gott, she whispered, touching the sack as if it might vanish. Mein Gott, they came back. Friedrich did not understand. Who came back? The Americans? She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. They destroyed us, Friedrich. They had every right to leave us to die. But they came back. He wanted to argue. He wanted to point out that this was strategy, not charity, that the Americans were defending their geopolitical interests, not feeding Germans out of kindness. But the words died in his throat because he had seen the pilots' faces. He had seen them stumble from their cockpits after 12-hour shifts, too exhausted to speak, and then climb back in for another run. Strategy did not look like that. Strategy did not fall asleep standing up at the refueling station. September brought the first crash. A C-47 went down short of the runway at Tempelhof, killing its crew of 3. The pilot was named Robert W. Stuber from Texas. The co-pilot was Howard C. Brown from Pennsylvania. The crew chief was Royce W. Stevens from California. Friedrich learned their names from the newspaper, along with this fact. They had been flying their 93rd supply mission in 60 days. 3 men dead, delivering flour to people who had been their enemies 1,300 days earlier. The crashes continued. A British Halifax hit power lines near Gatow. A C-54 lost an engine on approach and cartwheeled across the runway. By the end of the operation, 31 American airmen and 39 British would die in the Berlin Airlift. 13 German civilians would die too, struck by falling aircraft or crushed in ground accidents. Friedrich began keeping a list of their names. He did not know why. Perhaps it was the accountant in him, the need to tabulate losses. Perhaps it was something else, a growing sense that he owed these strangers something more than his continuing survival. One October evening, he stood at the Tempelhof fence and watched a C-54 make its final approach. The landing gear came down, the flaps extended, and then, with 50 feet to go, the left engine coughed black smoke. The pilot fought for control, but physics was unforgiving. The plane hit the runway hard, bounced, and slewed sideways. Friedrich heard himself shouting, though he did not know what words came out. The aircraft rolled to a stop. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the crew door opened and 4 men stumbled out, coughing but alive. The fire trucks arrived within seconds. The ground crews had become frighteningly efficient at their grim work, and within 8 minutes the wrecked plane had been pushed off the runway, and another C-54 was landing in its place. The operation did not pause. It could not pause. 2 million people were counting their calories. That night, Friedrich could not sleep. He lay in his narrow bed in Frau Miller's boarding house and listened to the aircraft overhead. 1 every 3 minutes. A mechanical heartbeat that never stopped. He thought about Robert W. Stuber from Texas, who would never return to whatever home he had left behind. He thought about his own arm, buried in some anonymous mass grave with the other surgical waste from 1945. He thought about the propaganda he had believed as a 19-year-old soldier, that Americans were monsters, subhuman creatures bent on destroying German civilization. The propaganda had been very specific. Americans were cowards who only knew how to drop bombs from safety. Americans were materialistic creatures without culture or honor. Americans, and here the propaganda grew most vicious, saw human life as expendable, a resource to be calculated and discarded. But the men flying over his head, flying through exhaustion and weather and mechanical failure, flying until they crashed into the very earth they were trying to save, these men did not match the description. Friedrich's hatred, which he had nursed for 3 years like a sick child, began to develop cracks. December brought Gail Halvorsen. Lieutenant Halvorsen was a C-54 pilot from Utah, 27 years old, with a face like a farm boy and an idea that would become legend. He had been making a regular supply run when he noticed the children gathered at the end of the Tempelhof runway, watching the planes land. On impulse, he reached into his flight bag and found 2 sticks of chewing gum. He broke them in half and tossed the pieces over the fence. The children swarmed the gum like it was gold. Halvorsen, moved by their reaction, made a promise. Next time he would bring more candy. He would drop it by parachute so it would not hurt anyone when it landed. He was as good as his word. Using handkerchiefs as parachutes, Halvorsen and his crew began dropping candy bars, chocolate, and chewing gum to the children of Berlin. He would wiggle his plane's wings as he approached, the signal that the candy bomber was coming, and kids would flood the area around the runway, hands raised to the sky. Word spread. Other pilots joined the effort. American school children donated their candy rations. The operation grew until hundreds of pounds of sweets were falling on Berlin every week, each piece attached to a tiny parachute made from handkerchiefs, scarves, or scraps of cloth. Friedrich first saw it happen on a gray December afternoon. He had been walking past Tempelhof when he heard the children shouting. A C-54 was approaching, its wings dipping left and right in Halvorsen's signature move. Then from the aircraft's door, dozens of tiny parachutes deployed, drifting down like strange snow. The children ran, laughing, scooping up the candy with desperate joy. Friedrich watched a girl, perhaps 8 years old, thin as a rail, catch a Hershey bar attached to a white handkerchief. She stared at it as if she had never seen anything so beautiful, then carefully unwrapped it and took the smallest possible bite, savoring it, making it last. 3 years earlier, that girl would have been hiding in a shelter while American bombers turned her world to ash. Now she was savoring American chocolate, dropped by American pilots who had no obligation to care whether she lived or died. Friedrich felt something break inside him. It was not a clean break, like bone. It was a slow crumbling, like a wall finally surrendering to weather and time. He found himself at a church the following Sunday. The first time since the war ended, the pastor was speaking about forgiveness, about the possibility of redemption, about how God worked in mysterious ways. Friedrich barely listened. He was thinking about the handkerchief parachutes, about Robert W. Stuber from Texas, about the young pilot he had seen sleeping upright at the refueling station because there was no time to lie down. After the service, he approached the pastor. "Father," he said, "I need to know something. Is it possible to hate someone and be grateful to them at the same time?" The pastor, a thin man who had buried too many of his congregation during the war, considered the question. "I think," he said slowly, "that is where forgiveness begins. Not in forgetting, but in holding both truths at once." January 1949 brought the coldest winter in Berlin's recorded history. Temperatures dropped to minus 26 degrees Celsius. Coal became more precious than food. You could survive hunger, but you could not survive freezing. The airlift adapted. The Americans began flying coal instead of food, tons upon tons of it, enough to keep the city's power plants running and its people from freezing to death. The coal came in paper sacks that turned the aircraft black inside. Pilots breathed coal dust, slept with coal grime under their fingernails, coughed up black phlegm. The planes themselves deteriorated faster, their engines clogged with dust, their interiors coated with soot. But the coal kept coming. Friedrich, who had been reassigned to help coordinate supply distribution in the British sector, saw the statistics. In January alone, the airlift delivered 93,000 tons of coal. Each ton represented multiple flights, multiple risks, multiple opportunities for disaster. The mathematics of survival were brutal and beautiful. 12,000 people would die if the temperature dropped another 5 degrees and the coal stopped flowing. Therefore, the coal would not stop flowing. He began to understand something about the American character that propaganda had never captured. It was not that Americans were saints. He had seen enough drunken GIs and black market profiteers to know better. It was that they approached problems with a terrifying optimism, a belief that any obstacle could be overcome with enough organization and willpower. The airlift was impossible, therefore they would do it. Berlin could not be supplied by air, therefore they would supply it. Pilots could not fly in weather this bad, therefore they would fly in it. The Russians, for their part, seemed genuinely baffled. Stalin had calculated correctly from a logical standpoint that the Western powers would either abandon Berlin or start a shooting war. He had not anticipated this third option, that the Americans would simply ignore the impossible and proceed anyway. In February, Soviet authorities approached the Western military governors with a proposal: lift the blockade in exchange for German neutrality and a unified currency under Soviet control. It was a reasonable offer, the kind that diplomats in warm offices might have found attractive. General Clay rejected it within hours. The message was clear: Berlin would be supplied. Period. No negotiations, no compromises, no surrender disguised as diplomacy. Friedrich read about this decision in the newspaper and felt a strange emotion stirring in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it. Pride. Not German pride, the war had burned that out of him, but something more fundamental. Pride in the species, perhaps. Pride that human beings could choose the difficult right over the easy wrong. April 16th, 1949. The Easter Parade. The airlift operation had become so efficient, so refined, that the commanders decided to demonstrate their capability in the most dramatic way possible. For 24 hours, every aircraft in the Allied inventory would fly maximum capacity runs into Berlin. The goal: break 12,000 tons in a single day. Friedrich heard about the plan from a British logistics officer. Madness, the man said cheerfully. Absolute madness. We're going to do it anyway. The operation began at midnight. Aircraft took off from bases across western Germany in a continuous stream, spaced precisely apart in time and altitude. The 3 Berlin airports operated with inhuman precision: land, unload, refuel, take off, all in 49 minutes. No delays, no mistakes, no margin for error. Friedrich took the day off from work, something he never did, and positioned himself at Tempelhof with a notebook. He was going to count them. Every single aircraft, every single landing, every single ton of supplies. The first plane touched down at 12:02 a.m., a C-54 carrying 10 tons of flour. By dawn, Friedrich had counted 187 aircraft. His hand was cramping from writing, but he did not stop. By noon, 392. The sky was a continuous stream of metal and noise. By evening, 621. His notebook was nearly full. At midnight, when the 24-hour period ended, Friedrich's final count was 1,398 aircraft, 12,941 tons of supplies, one plane landing somewhere in Berlin every 62 seconds for an entire day and night. He walked home in a daze, his ears ringing from the engine noise, his hand numb from writing. Frau Müller was waiting up for him, which was unusual. "Did you hear?" she asked. "On the radio?" "Hear what?" "Stalin is considering lifting the blockade." "They say this." She gestured toward the sky, where the aircraft were still coming, still landing, still refusing to accept defeat. This convinced them it was hopeless. Friedrich sat down heavily. He had lost his arm to American bombs. He had lost his family, his city, his entire world to the war. And now, watching the same military power that had destroyed everything he loved pour its resources into saving him, he finally understood what Frau Müller had meant 9 months earlier. They came back. Not out of obligation, not even out of strategy, really. They came back because somewhere in the American national character was a stubborn refusal to let people starve when there was something, anything, that could be done about it. May 12, 1949. The blockade ended. The official announcement came at midnight. All restrictions on ground traffic to Berlin were lifted. The trains began running again, the trucks rolled, the canals reopened. But the airlift did not immediately stop. The commanders, not trusting Stalin's word, kept the flights running at full capacity for several more months, building up stockpiles against the possibility of another blockade. By the time the last supply flight landed on September 30th, 1949, the statistics were almost incomprehensible. 277,728 flights, 2.3 million tons of supplies. 92 million German marks spent by the United States and Britain. 78 Allied personnel dead. 13 German civilians dead. 1.5 million people saved from starvation. Friedrich stood at the Tempelhof fence on that final day, September 30th, and watched the last C-54 touch down. The pilot climbed out. Friedrich did not know his name, would never know his name, and performed the same routine, that hundreds of pilots had performed thousands of times, post-flight check, paperwork, debriefing. Then the man walked to a waiting truck and was driven away, just another tired soldier going home. No ceremony, no speeches. The job was done, so they left. Friedrich raised his remaining hand in a salute. It was an odd gesture from a civilian, a former enemy soldier at that, but he did not care who saw. The pilot did not see it anyway. He was already gone, but Friedrich held the salute for a long moment regardless. "Thank you," he said to the empty air. "Thank you for coming back." In the years that followed, Friedrich Hartmann would tell this story many times. To his children, born in the 1950s when West Germany was rebuilding itself into an economic miracle. To his grandchildren who would grow up in a Germany reunified and at peace. To journalists when the anniversaries came around and someone wanted to interview a man who had lived through both the bombing and the airlift. Each time they would ask him the same question. How did you reconcile it? How did you accept help from the people who took your arm? And each time Friedrich would think about the handkerchief parachutes, about Robert W. Stuber from Texas, about the young pilot sleeping upright at the refueling station. He would think about the mathematics of survival, 12,941 tons in a single day, and the mathematics of choice, 78 Allied personnel who died saving a city they had no obligation to save. I learned, he would say, that human beings are more complicated than propaganda. I learned that nations can choose to be better than their worst moments. I learned that the same hands that destroy can also rebuild, if the people attached to those hands decide that rebuilding matters. He never stopped feeling the phantom pain in his missing arm. The shrapnel wound ached when the weather changed, a permanent reminder of February 15th, 1945. But he also never forgot the sound of aircraft engines landing every 3 minutes, refusing to let Berlin starve. Both memories were true. Both memories shaped him. In 1998, on the 50th anniversary of the airlift, Friedrich returned to Tempelhof Airport. He was 82 years old now, bent with age, his remaining hand gnarled with arthritis. The airport was hosting a memorial ceremony, and several surviving airlift pilots had been flown in from the United States. Friedrich stood in the crowd, listening to the speeches, watching the old pilots, now in their 70s and 80s, embrace German civilians they had saved half a century earlier. Then he saw him. Gail Halvorsen, the candy bomber, now white-haired but still recognizable from the photographs. Friedrich approached slowly, unsure of what he wanted to say. Halvorsen saw him coming and smiled, that same farm boy smile from 1948. "Were you here during the airlift?" Halvorsen asked. "Yes," Friedrich said. "I watched you drop the chocolate. I saw the children catch it. Did you get any?" Friedrich shook his head. "I was too old, too proud. But I watched." He paused. "I was a German soldier during the war. I lost my arm to an American bomb in February 1945. He said it matter-of-factly, watching for Halvorsen's reaction. The old pilot studied Friedrich's face for a long moment, then his empty sleeve. "I'm sorry," Halvorsen said quietly, "for your loss, for all of it." "Don't be," Friedrich said. "Without that bomb, without that injury, I might have kept believing the lies. I might have died hating you and everyone like you." He smiled, a real smile. "Instead, I got to watch you save my city. I got to see that enemies can become something else if they choose to." They talked for an hour. Two old men who had been on opposite sides of a war and opposite sides of a miracle. When Friedrich finally said goodbye, Halvorsen pulled something from his pocket. A Hershey Bar, still in its wrapper. "I always carry a few," he said, "in case I meet someone who missed the drop." Friedrich took it with his remaining hand. He did not unwrap it immediately. He held it, feeling the weight of chocolate and memory and reconciliation. "Thank you," he said. "For the chocolate, for everything." "Thank you," Halvorsen replied, "for giving us the chance to be better than we were." Friedrich Hartmann died in 2003 at the age of 87. In his will, he requested that the Hershey Bar, still unopened, carefully preserved, be donated to the Airlift Museum at Tempelhof. It sits there now in a glass case, labeled with his story, a German soldier who lost his arm to American bombs and learned to see his former enemies as saviors. Visitors pause at that case and read the placard, trying to comprehend the psychological journey from hatred to gratitude, from war to peace. The answer, if there is one, lies not in words, but in numbers. 277,728 flights, 2.3 million tons of supplies, 78 lives given for 2 million lives saved. The sky that once rained, bombs learned to rain chocolate. The engines that brought death brought life. And a one-armed man learned that the human capacity for transformation, both individual and collective, exceeds even the most optimistic propaganda. The blockade ended 75 years ago. The airlift pilots are nearly all gone now, joined in death by the Berliners they saved. But the lesson remains, carved into the runways of Tempelhof, written in the mathematics of impossible logistics, whispered in the memory of handkerchief parachutes drifting through winter air. We are capable of better. We can choose to come back. We can deliver chocolate instead of bombs, if only we decide that saving lives matters more than settling scores. Friedrich knew this because he lived it. He felt it in his missing arm and in his full stomach. He saw it in the eyes of pilots too exhausted to stand and in the faces of children catching candy from the sky. The greatest weapon, he learned, is not the bomb. It is the choice to set the bomb aside and fly a different mission entirely.